This week we have a new guest with us, Derek Evely of Canada. And Derek is the first person I met as it related to developing our relationship with Dr. Bondarchuk. He was working in Canada, and Dr. Bondarchuk was applying for a job, ironically, which is kind of funny that you get the greatest of all time in your field to come look for a job with you, regardless of who you are.
Yeah,
and so
it's a
Derek,
real interesting story.
yeah, so I've heard the story before, but if you would just give us an idea, the story of how he came to you and how that relationship developed.
Well, basically, I got an email one day from his son-in-law, Igor Shibarev, who was a former NHL hockey player, was retired from that, living in Calgary. He's married to Dr. Bondarchuk's daughter, Tanya, or Tatiana. And they were looking to, Dr. B was in Kuwait. I've been there for about 8 years at the time, 7 or 8 years. And kind of in obscurity. He sort of hadn't been out there, hadn't done any conferences. A lot of people didn't even know where he was. But he was looking to come to Canada, was tired of living in the heat, basically. And so they sent me an email, and it was just it was very odd email. It was hello. It was actually sent to the president of our club, which at the time was Dylan Armstrong's mother. And she forwarded it to me and said, can you deal with this? And I said, sure. I looked at it. It was like, my father-in-law would like to come to Canada. Can you give him a job? That's literally what it said. Here's who he's coached. And there was, Yuri Sadiq at the beginning. And I knew instantly, of course, being a student of Dr. Bondarchuk's work before that, I knew who it was. And I've said this famously before. I thought it was a joke. I thought it was a friend of mine who at the time was the throws coach at Clemson, a guy named Glenn McAdie. I thought, who a lot of your listeners will know who that is. I thought him and I go back and forth. We tease each other a lot. I thought it was him playing a practical joke, and I sent him an email, and I said, very funny. And he was, no, it wasn't me. So I ended up calling Igor, and sure enough, I was blown away. It was true. The problem is at the time, I was the only full-time private coach in the country in athletics. Literally the only one. There's more now, but at the time, and I was making about 30 grand a year. We were a tiny club with little kids. I had Dylan Armstrong, another guy named Gary Reed, who won a world champs medal in the 800, a guy named Shane Nemi. So I had enough athletes out there that I guess when they did a search for, athletics Canada in Canada or Hammer Canada, our club website came up. So so that's how they got a hold of us. But I initially said to them, I said, well, I'd love to have them, but there's no way that we can afford them. They can barely afford my salary. And so we just, but we stayed in touch for a year or so about it. Right at the same time, we had developed a fundraiser in Kamloops that I had built up over about 7 or 8 years. And right when they got a hold of us, it had started to really take off. And it was a manure sale. You've probably heard of it.
Yeah.
And where it sounds, we get a lot of laughs when I tell people about it, and they chuckle. And until I tell them the last 3 years, we made $50,000 a weekend selling this manure. So after, when that started, the year they got a hold of us, it had skyrocketed from 27,000 up to about 42 and then 50. And so when we hit 50, I said to the president, Dylan's mom, I said, well, why the hell can't we do this? I mean, we got more money than we know what to do with. Yeah. Let's just offer him something. So we offered him a really modest package. Like, it was very little money, about 30 grand a year, 32 or something like that. I honestly didn't think he would take it. But we also, I renovated my basement suite. We let him have that for nothing. And a couple other perks that we gave him, and he took it instantly didn't even negotiate. Just said, "Yep, I'm there." He really wanted to come to Canada. So next thing, it took about 3 years after that, going back and forth. He had some health issues. He didn't want to leave the hammer thrower he had at the time, the Kuwaiti kid, didn't want to leave him prior to the 2004 Olympics. So he landed in Kamloops on April 1st, 2005, which ironically was the day of the manure sale. So I literally drove to the airport in our manure van. I was wearing coveralls, I had shit all over me, picked him up, him and Igor, drove him back to my house, showed him the apartment, said, look, I got to go. I'm in the thick of this, so just hang out here. I'll come back. I came back. I didn't see him again till 10 o'clock that night, and I came home. That's when I got back from, the day's events. I go down into the basement, and the door to his suite, it flies open, and he comes charging out, and he goes, Derek, Sid, we write book. And he had been up all night, and he wrote 4 pages of a book that he wanted to write with me. And he had literally translated it Russian to English with a Russian-English dictionary.
Right.
And he goes, you put in computer. So that started about a 6-month process where we sat down, we went to work out every morning, and we would come home, and the next 3 hours we would spend in front of a computer. He would have 2 pages of writing or 3 pages of writing from the night before, and we would slam it out into a book. And that became, that was the start of the evolution, which led to your relationship with him. And we never published that book. It's very similar to the other books that he's had published in Russia, the periodization books. But the interesting thing about it is that, him and we struggled with a lot of that whole process. And after about 6 months, we decided, after 6 chapters, because it would literally take a day to write a paragraph.
Yeah.
And we would we put it away. We wrote all those graphs you see in those periodization books are all ones that I did. He would write it by hand, and I would do it on computer, and we go back and forth. And those are the original graphs in those first 2 books, I believe, of the periodizations. The ones in the later ones are different. I don't think they're as good either, but it was, and I think that the job we did was actually, I didn't look at it for 8 years. And then Martin Bingisser, I shared it with him. I've never shared the book with anybody, but as per Dr. B's wishes. I shared it with Martin, and Martin's like, hey, I can actually understand this. It's actually pretty good. Because those periodization books that he did, they're very valuable if you're into the system, but they're not translated very well. They're nowhere near as good as Transfer Training or some of the ones that he's done with Dr. Yesis. Yeah. You can actually read those. You can hardly read these, but our book is, it's and our book doesn't go into depth. We weren't. You get the basic message from all of his ideas, but we weren't able to go deep into the science that he tried to with the Russian translated book. So, but anyways, that's basically the story. The rest is history. I left after a year, took a job in Edmonton, and he stayed, and he's been there ever since.
Yeah, and then ultimately he became the national throws coach, I think, for Canada too. After that, is that correct?
Yeah, that was really interesting because when I first had the opportunity, and I knew he was coming, which was around 2003.
Yeah,
I was a staff coach for Canada at the World Champs in Paris. And after the World Champs, I took a train across Europe and went to Sambate, where he was doing his first clinic in like 12 years or something. And I met him there, and he signed the contract there. Before I did that, I went to our provincial federation and our national federation, to the head coaches and the performance directors, and I said, look, we have this opportunity here. Do you want to get on board? And they were just instantly said no. They just, no, we're not interested. And I was like, all right, well, we're going to do it ourselves. Yeah. And it wasn't, it wasn't until Dylan's, after 2000, around 2007, 2006, 2007, when Dylan started tearing it up, that they finally got on board, and they realized, I think just more out of embarrassment, I
Yeah.
think they didn't want to be embarrassed, and so they decided to give him a job. So, which was good.
Yeah. That's a sad that you'd have to be talked into giving him a job to do and
Yeah.
doing what he does better than anybody.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, he's not without his issues, as we all know. I mean,
Yeah.
he's your classic genius,
Yeah.
right?
He is
He really,
brilliant.
he knows more about anybody in the world on a few very special, specific topics. But trying to get him to manage his life or just basic things around a track, forget it. It's not
Yeah.
going to happen.
Yeah.
And
He's
so
not worried about
I
it. He's
think
got bigger things on his mind.
exactly. And so, it was, he needs that base. I mean, he had all that in Russia, obviously.
Yeah.
And I think that he lacked that in Canada. And that's, the situation has suffered a little bit because of it. But, I mean, thank God that, that you guys came along with these books, and Martin and I have been trying to sort of share as much as we can with what he, on the practical side of things,
Yeah.
like how does it actually look day to day,
Yes.
how
Yes.
you work
Yes.
your system.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think we're all just trying to get it out there and help them. And, because it's very easy to misunderstand Dr. B, and it's very easy to make assumptions about him and things like that. And, we all just try to sort of clarify things, I think. And I think between all of us, we've done a pretty good job.
Yeah, I think, when we got started, I didn't really know exactly, how it would evolve. And the one thing that I appreciated about him once we got together in person was that he didn't mind talking practical stuff. You start asking practical questions. He's more of a coach. He's a scientist and he's a genius, like you said, but he's a coach. And
Yeah.
he doesn't mind coach talking, if you will. He doesn't, like, if we're in a practical conversation, we'll talk about specifics, and he'll say, well, he'll say it depends, like a lot of them do, but he'll give you some practical data. So that's what I want to talk about with you today, because
Sure.
you worked with him side by side. So prior to him getting there, if you could briefly give us just a quick idea what your approach was before he got to Canada, your coaching approach.
Well, I'd studied a lot, like a lot of other throws coaches. He was
Sure.
my go-to source of information in terms of his, he's legendary. I read a lot of his stuff. This takes us right into the nuts and bolts of the theory. I mean, all his previous stuff. I mean, he's so academic that it's very hard to, when you read his past articles,
right?
And God knows how they've been translated and who translated them and things like that. But there are things there in retrospect that I thought I understood, but then when I saw him and worked with him, I realized I was, had no idea. And I know, like, a really good example is, if you look in a lot of his past articles, he talks about the three reactions to training, which are, when you present a program or a stimulus, the athlete goes up, then plateaus, or they go down, then up, then plateau, or they go level, down, and up and plateau. Those are whether you're a 1, 2, or 3. And anyone who's talked to his athletes will all tell you, oh, I'm a 1, or I'm a 2, or I'm a 3. I remember him telling me that Sadiq was a 3, and 3s are very rare, and all this kind of stuff. Well, I had no idea what that really meant. I thought that those charts, and so as did a lot of my colleagues who are much smarter than I am, we all assumed that those charts meant those were loading patterns, but they're not. They're a reflection of an athlete's reaction to a stimulus and training. And even that is misleading, because what you have to understand with that is that you only get those reactions if you don't wave load, volume, and intensity. Okay. So now I'm getting into, but just to back up and answer your question. So I studied a lot of his, but I also studied a lot of Vershansky's work, a big fan of his. I studied a lot of German wave loading and things like that. And I did a very standard, with Dylan, I did a very standard 1 or 2 or 3 periodized 2 or 3 period model based on a lot of German wave loading. And the only thing I would say that I really sort of understood from Dr. Bondarchuk's work before I started working with him that I got right was the idea of change. The idea of when you change something, you change everything at once. I was doing that with Dylan to very great effect.
Yeah.
But on the other, we were big into the maximal strength with Dylan, so that's another thing that got changed. But I'm sure we'll get into that when we start.
Sure.
Yeah.
So
but
this background.
My back, just to be clear, my background is it was very, it's almost a twist of fate that Dr. B ended up in Kamloops, because I have been from the get-go a huge fan of methodology of training and a huge student of it. So I've studied, and I don't think he understood that when he first got here. He thought that I was just some guy who didn't know absolutely anything, and I didn't know anything compared to him. But I was well schooled on all the different models of training. At least I thought I was.
Yeah. Well, you at least had a background in that area where he could have landed with a coach who didn't even know who he was, and that would have been a whole different scenario, which can happen. Every now and then I'll run into somebody who is a track and field guy and doesn't know who he is, which I don't know how that happens, but it does happen. You'll find.
Well, you're not a throws coach if you don't know who Anatoly Bondarchuk is.
You shouldn't be one, right? I think you should look for another job.
You can forgive a sprint coach, or especially an endurance coach, but you can't forgive a throws coach.
No, you're in the wrong profession. You chose the wrong profession if you don't know who he is. So and this is what I always am interested in. And Jeff and I, these are the conversations we always have. The theory is great, but I like to know what do you actually do? So here's what I'd like to do, if you don't mind.
Sure.
You already had an idea, and what your story is somewhat similar to mine in the sense that I was schooled mainly in what the Russians were doing, because that's my first encounter with any of this stuff was in the early 90s was with Dr. Yesus, who was the world's expert, or the United States expert on Soviet stuff. He was the guy that had really researched it the most, started way back in the 50s. He'd went over there multiple times. He could speak and write Russian, so he could communicate with them very easily. So that's all I knew. I didn't know there was another approach, really. I mean, I knew there was, but I didn't know what it was. All I knew was that. But what was interesting, then I started meeting these guys and realizing that after I'd read their stuff, I still didn't know what they would do, like exactly what a day would look like. And that's what I'm a practical guy. I want to know, what are we going to do exactly? And then what's the rationale for how we're doing what we're doing, instead of telling me the theory. So what I'm interested in, there's a couple of things that are unique about him. One is his exercise selection is a little bit unique, especially when it comes to heavier and lighter. He's the master of that, obviously. The other way that he's different is periodization models. I haven't seen his periodization models be carried out by many other people that I know of. You know what I mean? And one of the other ones is, and this has kind of become in vogue in the United States, and I don't know why now or what it is, but a lot of people, as you said before, you mentioned before, maximal strength was kind of the big deal for throwers. And he's like, look, I remember talking to him, and he's like, look, maximal strength training should only be at the most 10% of the year for a high level guy. He says, it's not a good idea. He likes the lower percentages, and a lot of times he's in the 60 to 70% range where they live at most of the year. They'll come off of that a little bit, but that's where the bulk of their year is at. So that method really is unique, especially amongst at least Americans. I don't know about how it is in Canada, but that would be a unique idea here.
Similar.
So okay, so it'd be a unique idea up there for you guys, or it'd be different than the norm. So if you would talk about your exercise selection prior, and how did he change that?
Well, I was probably a bit unique in that I was doing, changing the exercises and changing them all as a group beforehand, but let's just assume I wasn't. Okay. That was, the big thing with him that nobody seems to understand, and everybody struggles to get their head around, is this idea. Well, two ideas really. One is a complex methodology. So the idea that you're doing everything at the same time. So if you look at his 4 exercise classifications, you're training all abilities. Now, you don't need to understand the exercise classification systems to really get it. You could use any of the traditional terminology, specific strength,
Sure.
General strength, throwing, whatever. I like using his system because it's simple, but you can. But the idea that you're working all of those abilities in, if not all the time, like in every single workout, which is what he does usually. Okay, that's a big one, and that relates to your exercise selection, because when you give an athlete a program and you have a group of exercises, when it comes time to change, if you're doing a complex methodology, which is usually the one he uses, then you need to change everything at once. And you need to understand that program in its entirety is almost like a single stimulus. And what he does is he, on 2 sort of levels, is he is always searching for, number one, what are the right exercises that create and stimulate adaptation? Okay. And what are the groups of exercises? So there's kind of the same thing, but not really. They're like, what is the right program that works? And within that, what are the right actual exercises which give you, which make the athlete throw far? And by exercises, I mean everything. So we would, like in throwing, if you're a hammer thrower, a 5 kilo ball versus a 7 kilo ball, those are different exercises. We call each one of those an exercise, just so you understand that. Because I struggled with that at the beginning. He would go, need to change exercises. And I would think, okay, we're just going to change the weight room exercises. No, exercises means all the physical exercise. Is synonymous with physical activity. Anything physical, whether it's throwing, special exercises, weight room, or general strength. That's that. So there's really no. He looks at it differently. Traditionally in North America, we get really hung up on these. Well, I got to do cleans, I got to do squat, and I got to do bench all the time, because those are the big power exercises. Those are very good exercises. They, for certain athletes, they're important. They need to be, there's a place for them in the system at some point, at some level. But Dr. B doesn't really look at it that way. He looks at it like, I mean, if doing a cartwheel is going to transfer and make you a better thrower, that's an important exercise to him. So that's kind of how he looks at it. He's not hung up on any one exercise because of its nature. He's hung up on an exercise if it gives you transfer. And how do you know it gives you transfer? You have to experiment with it. You've got to use it, and you've got to track data. And so, for instance, if I give an athlete a program, I can tell you what, a British girl that I use as an example all the time when I'm talking about this, Sophie Hitchin. I found over in the last few years with her, the last year I worked with her, a snatch pull was, whenever I had snatch pulls in the program and a certain loading pattern or similar loading pattern, her 4K hammer would go through the roof. Another exercise that transferred really well with her was a box jump, jumping up onto a box and then landing in a high jump pit with heavy dumbbells, right? I mean, we just made shit up, and whatever stuck to the wall, that's what we used. Okay, so people struggle with that idea. We are so bent on this black and white thinking that traditionalists thinking that there are certain things that we have to do all the time that are traditional, but the only thing you have to do all the time, or you got to cycle in and out, are the exercises that transfer. And they could be anything. They could be different. Now, I do find that certain exercises transfer better than others traditionally. But it really is individual. Okay. And the higher up you go in that classification scheme, obviously, is, the more they transfer. So, I mean, all you got to do is look at the charts in Dr. Bondarchuk's book, Transfer Training, and it's all right there. I'm not entirely. I mean, you have to remember too. Those numbers are big generalities. Okay, so I have found that I think some of those exercises probably transfer a little bit better than Dr. Bondarchuk gives credit for. But overall, it's about right. It's about my experience, right? So that's kind of the answer. It's a hard question to answer because it's hard to get specifics,
Yeah, that's kind of what, and that was kind of what I was looking for, Derek. I think I've spent time with him obviously as well, being his publisher, and one thing that I thought was interesting is that he's not in love with any exercises. He's not.
Exactly. That's a great way to.
He's not in love with anything. And I remember people asking him. When we did the conference in Grand Rapids, people were saying, "What do you think about?" Because box squats got real popular in the United States, with powerlifters and stuff like that. And so they asked him, "What do you think about box squats?" He's like, "They're all right." I mean, it was very nonchalant.
Exactly.
It's like I don't think about them. And then they asked him a lot of different other questions, and he's like, what are you asking me, basically? And so what was interesting that I picked up from him, this is what he told me. We were talking. He said, "You got to constantly be changing. That's the problem." He said, "That's the problem. You're always doing." He said, so the way I interpreted what he was saying was the exercises or whatever, yes, the heavier and lighter I deal with the throws. That's a critical point. That does need to always, it's a part of the program, always. You always got to be throwing if you're a thrower. And so if you're a sprinter, you've got to always be sprinting to whatever degree. Now, it's going to take on different forms. The other exercises, beyond the actual competition exercise, he doesn't care. And he said, you're always experimenting. Like he told me, he said, good coach all the time change, all the time. He said, I'm constantly trying to figure out what works. So he will, so we did a 60%, let's say, squat, and we did, the Olympic lift might have been a snatch, and we were throwing this kilogram hammer, and we got good results. Okay, remember that. And they tracked the data through that cycle, and it got a better improvement than he had gotten previously. Okay, let's remember that. These couple exercises together might be a good combination for this guy. Only.
That's exactly it. That is exactly it. One of the big impacts that he had on me in terms of how I develop programs is, after using this system and getting some success with it, it really gave me a lot of confidence and the freedom to experiment.
Yes.
So I will try all kinds of crazy things, not stupid crazy things. Right. Like I'm not going to, you got to use common sense, but I will try. I'll try all kinds of different micro setups. I'll try, just how I set up the workouts. I try, and you need to have that change. I mean, the only real constant that I can say in his system there's a couple of them, but the number one big one is change. That is the most important principle. Yeah. But you got to know when to change. Yeah. I'm a big music fan, okay? And I'm a big Neil Young fan. I was reading an article, and I think this, this isn't just a joke. This, I think, speaks to, the human nervous system. And a reporter or a guy interviewing Neil Young was interviewed him one day, and he said to him, "What advice would you give to a young singer-songwriter that is stuck in a rut?" And his immediate answer was, "Change things."
Yeah.
I think the body has a fundamental desire for change, yes. Right? But you got to know when to do it because the body is going to react to any time that you make a change. And that's, and you really need to understand that if you're going to use this system, because it's super, super important. It's tricky. Yeah. And you need to back up your educated guesses, I guess you could call them, or your experience with data. You have to have the data. You got to have something to work off of. But I find it when it works really well, it's very reliable. And but again, you're changing on many different levels in this system, and it's just you just have to, you got to go out there and try. But I find it very liberating. A lot of people, a lot of coaches, it scares them because they, they're like, oh my God, what if I do this? And oh, I'm scared to do this. And that's, as long as you're not an idiot,
Yeah.
you're not overloading and killing them and getting them to do stupid things. You have a lot of flexibility in terms of how you can change on and where you can change. I mean,
Yeah.
Very important.
I do some work here with a baseball player who's playing at a relatively higher level, and when we'll go in, something that looks like what Bondarchuk would do, and the athlete will say, well, what are we going to do next cycle? And I'm like, I don't know yet. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I don't know. Let's see how this one works out first. And then let's see if I guessed good or not. If my guess was good, and if it's a bad guess, okay, then I got to go back to the drawing board. But what I do is we try right at the beginning of the cycle. Let's do some measurements on a couple things that are relevant that we think are correlative. Let's measure them, and then let's get to the end of the cycle and see if we improve those things that are correlative. And even week to week, we measure them. Let's see how we're doing. And if we're improving, then I guess good. If we're not, it's a bad guess on my part. So then we got to go back and maybe retool.
Here's the fundamental difference between, structurally, when we're talking about periodization and structure and how it looks. Here's the fundamental difference, which I wish Dr. B would kind of explain in his books at the beginning. I think it would help a lot of people,
right. Yeah.
But Dr. B, right? They got to figure that out for themselves.
Right. He
but
doesn't care.
Here's the basic thing, right? Like I think block periodization, which is a term thrown around for his system, I get where that comes from, and I get why people call it that. I've never heard him call it that, but
no, he doesn't.
Whatever.
He actually says it. The term has been kind of bastardized a little bit.
Exactly.
That's what he told me.
I think it should be called. I think it should be called reverse periodization, and for this reason, when you look at every other system of training, planning system, whether it's the old Matveyev model, even Vershansky's block periodization. You look at what Isurin does, and all these are great, by the way. I'm not saying that these are any better. You look at the Cheney model, which is probably the most representative of what a lot of high-end speed power guys are doing these days, which is, very high load all the time, small waves. But all of those systems are based on the idea that you start at a certain time and you plan out the year, and you're going to end at a certain time, and that ending is at your major championships, or that's when you're going to peak.
Yeah.
And you say, okay, we're going to start on this date, we're going to end on this day, or we're going to peak you on this date, and maybe a few other places here. We're going to divide this up into components right off the bat at the beginning. This is what I did for years and years and years. We're going to divide it all up. We're going to section it all out. We're going to put it into periods. You're going to do this here, that there, blah, 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 blah. And that's your season. And the whole thing is basically laid out before you even start your first workout.
Right.
Whereas you can't do that in this system. Okay. You can have an idea, and I've done it, based on, especially if you have a new athlete, you cannot do that with this, because this system flips it around. Rather than taking an athlete, making a plan, manipulating all the variables to make them peak at certain times. And to manipulate those variables, you have to play with volume and intensity. You've got to play with the load. You manipulate the load in order to get them to peak. That's not what he does. What Dr. Bondarchuk does is he gives them a load, a program, a workout. Okay, maybe it might be 2 workouts, it might be 3, but those don't change. And when I say they don't change, they do not change. Literally,
not even a little bit.
Yeah, not even a little bit. And I'll tell you a little story in a minute about that. So you start at the beginning, you don't know where the end is coming, especially if it's a new athlete. And what you do, it's like Chinese water torture. It's a drip. It's a constant, steady drip of dosages. Boom, 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 or drip, drip. Now, you may have 3 different drops, but those 3 different drops are always in the same order, and they're always the same drops. Drop number 2 is always the same. Drop number 3 is always the same. If you have 3 programs, let's say, okay? And then what you do is you record the athlete's reaction to training based upon specific measurables. In throwing, we're lucky in throwing because we can throw 10 times a week and every day, and we can measure. So I have tons of data, right?
Right.
In other events and other sports, you may not be able to do that, but you can always find a specific measurable.
Yes.
And that measurable should be as specific as possible, okay? So what you do is you measure that, and that becomes, you're looking for one of those 3 curves that we talked about. And when they hit peak condition, that's when things have to change. That's when you got to make a decision, when they hit peak condition and they start to plateau, okay, which is a whole other discussion. So last year I don't talk to Dr. B that much anymore because I just get too... every time I talk to him, I start questioning what I'm doing. And oh my God, it's just, I think I've, it's a struggle, but sometimes I do. And I stopped by his house last year and we were chatting. We weren't talking about anything I was doing in particular. We were chatting about something else, and he was using someone else that was struggling with an athlete as an example. And he looked at me and he goes, they change things. He goes, they in the middle of a cycle. He goes, they change in the middle of a cycle, because you can't change in the middle of a cycle. If you change in the middle of a cycle, then the athlete's going to react. Now, if that change, like in the other methodologies we talked about, the non-Bondarchuk methodologies for Shansky, Cheney, whatever the hell, or whatever it is you're doing, if you can, there's nothing wrong with that if you can rely on the outcome of that change. So if you have a planned change or a planned change in stimulus and you are wave loading volume and intensity, and you're doing it properly, then you can't. I mean, people do that to some success. I just find that when you start changing those, what I've learned in this system is when you start changing variables within a development cycle, all hell can break loose, and it's very hard to control the reaction of the athlete. That's why I really like this system. And I found it to be when you after a while, when you get to know an athlete and you get a lot of data behind you, it's bloody well foolproof. In terms of peaking, I mean, I just coached Sultana Purcell for the last year, and with her, it was 8 touches of a ball, 8 sessions. If we were doing one program, every eight workouts, she would reach peak. She'd reach peak condition very quickly. I usually use 2 or 3 programs. On a 3 program, 24 total sessions, boom, peak. Now, whether they improve or not depends upon the nature, the quality and content of that, of the exercises in that development cycle. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's, if you get that's where the transfer of training all comes in. You got to choose the right exercises. But pretty much with any exercises, they're going to peak. I mean, she would peak after eight sessions of each program. She would peak like clockwork. The only difference is how much of a peak it was and how much growth from cycle to cycle depended upon the choice of exercises and how well I chose those exercises in that program. If I chose them well, there was good growth. If I chose them poorly, there wasn't as clean a line, but definitely session 8, session 16, session 24, boom, there'd be a peak, depending on how many programs I had. So, that is I can't say it enough. Every time I talk about this or I lecture on it, you can't wave load volume and intensity using this program. You have to get your head around having the confidence to be able to do that. And North American coaches just are not used to it.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure Russian coaches are used to it. Dr. B, you ask him if they do that program, he'll go, oh yeah, but I don't see them doing it. Well, I've been on 6 or 7, world championships team, a couple of Olympic teams. I've been to European champs, team champs, under 20, everything. And I've seen these guys train. I've been on training camps with them. I don't see them doing it the way Dr. B does it exactly, to be honest with you. He's very unique.
I would say, yeah, you're right. And as you know, I'm in contact with some of the other, world's experts in the field, and they said, no, this doesn't look. They've looked at what he does, and they said this doesn't look like block periodization. Number one, they said this is different. This doesn't adhere to the same principles. and they'll and everybody says he's brilliant and he's phenomenal getting results. We're not sure exactly what he's doing. Like, I got an idea, but I'm not like, and I've talked to a lot of experts, not just one, and they said, but I'm not exactly sure what he's doing exactly, and so he's unique in that way, that it's not like he definitely developed it himself. It's definitely his baby all the way around, and it's not based off of everybody else's work necessarily. Some of it is, some of it's not, and one of the things,
some of it is. Yeah.
What I'd like to touch on real quickly is one of the things that you talked about, and a lot of people don't realize this. A lot of like with Martin, we talked about what did he actually do, and he said, they work out about 10 times a week, Monday through Friday, normally for him, twice a day when he was training full time, and he said, and that workout was identical, every single workout. It was identical, and so the first thing I thought was, God, you got to be absolutely exhausted. He said, well, not necessarily. He said, because he said, I'm looking at, using 60%, higher velocity stuff. He said, and it's not killing me. He said, I'm in and out of there in less than an hour. He said, the workout's never more than an hour when he's in the weight room. And he said, it's not that bad at all. And so what kind of piqued me was that I thought, well, that's kind of interesting that you give the same irritant over and over and over again, and it keeps spurring more adaptation. Where my thought previously would have been, you got to get stagnant by the end of that, couple weeks, right? It's got to be.
You do, but you have to change it before they get stagnant. That's the thing. That's the key to the whole thing. Everybody gets stagnant with the same stimulus. You just have got to time it up right? And so that absolutely. It's all about change, and when you time change, right?
It's trying to trick the body is the way that I explain it to other people. You're playing a game with the body. You're tricking it into changing. And then when it figures out what you're doing, you got to trick it again. And you got to keep tricking it into thinking, what you want it to think. And that's it. He's totally different in that way. And that leads to the next question. The intensity level that he uses, that I've known him to use with the athletes, is very low, relatively speaking, especially to high level athletes, right? You're thinking, at least
it depends on what you're talking about, but yeah.
So like if you're in the weight room, you're not using 95%. No. Hardly ever. Most of it's low, and this is kind of interesting because it kind of is far different than like maybe Abadiev in weightlifting, where he's using high level intensity and he's using a lot. Dr. Bondarchuk he's training this frequently, but it's a much lower load. And what he told me was, he says, look, the bar, he said, when they throw the hammer, they move so many, meters per second. He said, the bar has to come somewhere in the ballpark. He said, it can't be moving at, 0.3 meters per second. He said, in the exercises, it's not going to translate. And this was how he explained to me why he's not a fan of high intensity stuff on any regular basis. He said, because it's not going to translate. He said, you got to be moving. He said, the hammer moves fast. You got to move fast. It's kind of his simplistic way of telling me. Could you kind of tell me your experience with that, or kind of how that?
Okay, you just open up about 10 doors. Okay,
great.
So first of all, the other thing, like how Dr. B, how this system manipulates peaking, okay, and the timing of peaking is he uses density. He manipulates density a lot more than a lot of traditional coaches do. Okay, and that's really important. So this is really important to understand this whole thing about these. You talk to the athletes and they that train in that program, and they go, oh, we throw 10 times a week, and everybody's like, well, I got to throw 10 times a week. You don't have to throw 10 times a week, but the idea is this. In those development cycles, okay. So remember, I said we start with a set of exercises, and at the end of the development cycle, they peak, okay. And you're trying to find out how many sessions are there, okay. That's one of your goals. So let's say that the athlete does it in 30 sessions, okay. So and they reach peak condition. Well, 30 sessions, if you're doing 10 sessions a week, is going to be how many weeks? 3 weeks. If you're doing 5 sessions a week, that's going to be what? It's going to be 6 weeks, right? And this is where another very important concept, and one of the big advantages to this system is this. Traditional periodization, when Matt VF started, was based on a single periodization model, which means you peak once a year. Right. We know now from working, any elite high performance coach will tell you that when an athlete is in peak condition, they have special reaction to training that only happens when you're in peak condition. There's a growth there. So in other words, a high level sprinter, when they are really, really fresh and they're really in peak condition and they're running workouts, maximal speed workouts, that's the kind of training that they can only get in that special form.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, if you peak once a year, you're only going to be in that zone once a year. So coaches started to figure this out in the 80s, and that's like Charlie Francis and some of the East Germans and that, and they started going from 1 to 3 peaks a year. They would peak indoors, peak an early outdoor, and then a major championships peak. Well, Bondarchuk says, fuck that even. Let's do it. Let's see how many we can get in. So the idea is, it goes back to the density. The shorter you can make that peak, the timelines, within reason, the more peaks you're going to get in a year. The more peaks you get in a year, the more overall growth the athlete has. They should theoretically get better in every single cycle. So by doing this, you're just going to improve more if you have 7 peaks a year than if you have 1. Okay. Yeah. So the density is really important there. Now, how does this relate to your question? Well, if you're throwing 10 times a week, and you're using a complex methodology that's Dr. B does, where you're doing everything in every single workout, means you're lifting 10 times a week. Right. Okay. Well, if you're lifting 10 times a week, you don't have a lot of energy. You don't have there's not a lot there in the neural bank to be able to be lifting maximally at 95% in those workouts every time and throwing 100%, because remember, you just sort of hinted there, the weightlifting coach can do it 10 times a week at 90% if it's in little bits, right? And that's how the Bulgarians and the Russians do it, right? But they're weightlifters. They only have to weightlift. Throwers, soccer players, football players, they got to make football their priority. We make throwing our priority. So the SPE, which are basically the weightlifting exercises. I'm being general there, but those can't interfere with that throwing, or if they're going to, they can't interfere hugely. So you can't go out and give a guy, 8 sets of 3 or 10 sets of 3 at 90% or 88% in a snatch, and you do that 10 times a week. He's not going to make it past workout 3. Right. Okay, so. Because he's also, even a weightlifter might not do that. So and if the guy's going out and taking 20 or 25 maximal intensity or, near maximal intensity throws in all 10 of those sessions, well, you're just only so much you can do, right? So yes, it is the transfer of training is an important reason why he doesn't lift in that zone, but pragmatics is part of it as well. You can only do it so many times before you kill the guy. Right. And so, I'll say it, I'm not afraid to say it, especially if the guy's clean. If the guy's clean, sure as hell isn't going to be able to do that, right? So you have to, there's a lot of reasons why he stays in that zone. Personally, I like what you said before about him telling you, maybe 10% of the year, because in the last he would use maximal strength, because in the last few years, I've dipped into it a little bit with some of the athletes at about that volume, oddly enough. There were certain development cycles, I threw in some max strength, very low dosages though, like very low volumes, Like, if we were say we were throwing 8 times a week, we might do it like 3 sets of 2, and just tap into that maximal strength. Not going real maximal strength, but just, getting in there. And with Sultana Frizzell, who's a former athlete of Dr. B's, I mean, I found huge success with it this year. The problem is, like all the exercises, you can't keep going back to it all the time because A, they'll adapt to it. Okay. And, and B, if it's too much, then you're going to fry them. So it's an art form. It's an art form. That's where the art of coaching comes in. And this is where he's such a genius in this way. You have to constantly be absorbing all of these observations and looking at your data and finding out, well, what the hell, what is working here? What's transferring? You got to look at the past, but you also got to look at the future. You got to experiment. You got to mix it up. You got to throw things against the wall. Coaches will come up and watch Dr. B train. Of course, he doesn't say shit to them, right? I mean, he won't, and so they sit there and they look and goes, oh, he's doing that. And they all come away thinking there's way more of a grand scheme to the exercise selection than there actually is. 80% of the time, when you see an athlete doing an exercise in that program, especially if it's a new athlete or a newer athlete, he's just throwing something against the wall to see if it sticks. If it doesn't stick, he tries something else in the next cycle. He doesn't, but over time you find what works, and when you do find what works, then you've got something special. You've got something reliable and effective that you can go back to. And this is the art form of it too. Let's say throughout a season, you're training for the Olympics this year. Let's say, through the early development cycles, through, the fall and spring, you discover in your athlete that, a hang snatch you're getting a good transfer out of it, or you think you are, whenever that's involved in the programs, they're throwing really well. Well, you don't put it in every program. Because if you put it in every program throughout the year, they're gonna adapt to it, and it's not gonna work when you need it. So if I find that information going into the spring, I'll take those exercises out and hold them back until my final development cycle going into the main competition, and then that is like the greatest hits of programming. Going into that, I will throw in all the key number one is the key hammers. I mean, it's very easy in these conversations. We always go back to the weight room exercises, but really the most important thing are what are the key hammers. Of course, they all transfer. We know that. Look at the chart and transfer training. They're all 0.8, 0.9, right? But you got to find out. We're talking tiny margins here when you're talking about an elite, high performance Olympic athlete. You need to find what is the exact hammer that transfers. And so, I've gone into, I've told this story before. I mean, with Sophie Hitchin going into the World Championships in Korea, we were at a training camp in Ulsan, Korea, and we got off the plane. We had a rough travel in that, but we were throwing. I found out that year that the 6 kilo hammer was really transferring well. A lot of throws coaches traditionally will tell you that's a very heavy hammer for a female. They normally throw the 4 kilo in competition. But all year, every time she threw the 6K, her results would go through the roof, okay? We also had a 3 kilo hammer in there as well. So we get to Korea. I give her the 6K, a 4K, and I think a 3K, right? So we're in there training. Head coach, a man named by Charles Van Comedy, who was also a really accomplished throws coach, that had a world champs medalist in the female shot. He came to me, he's watching our workouts, and he's going, why are you throwing heavy hammers? You shouldn't be throwing heavy hammers this close to a major competition. And like an idiot, I took it out. And she just went like that. And she crashed. She didn't even make the final, had one of the worst meets of her season. I was kicking myself. Fast forward a year later, same athlete, training camp in Portugal, same head coach. We're going into the Olympics, a home Olympics, okay? and we're throwing. I think it was a 5.5 that year that was transferring really well. And so I saved it. I held off the 5.5 until we got in our final phase, the final development cycle. She's throwing the 5.5. We're throwing in Portugal at the throwing ring. Along comes Charles. He goes, "Hey, you're throwing heavy hammers again." And I just turned to him and went, "Hey, back off." He's a buddy of mine, right? So I said to him, "Fuck off, okay? I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm doing." So, and she just went, peaked, bam, peaked on the day, British record in qualifying for a 20 with the youngest and smallest girl in the competition, made the final. It was just a huge success story. I mean, so it's, and so, a lot of throws go to, "Oh, you don't throw heavy hammers." I don't give a shit what it is. If it transfers, I'm going to use it.
Yeah, that's what it all comes down to. Like I here with the athletes here, I tell them, I said, look, there's only one measurement that matters, and that's the CTC measurement. That's the cut to check one. Did they pay you to do what you do? Did they give you a medal or a scholarship? If you didn't get one of the three, I don't care what it's irrelevant. So I tell them, look, I'm not in love with I'm in love with you winning. I'm not in love with anything else. I don't care about the exercise. I don't, there's, I think some have better transfer situations, but as you said, it depends on where we're at. And it depends on the level of athlete too. I mainly worked with just lower level athletes. You guys have worked with more world-class athletes, but the same idea is still that the periodization model is different, but the concept is we're always got to be focused on, are you doing what you do way better or not? Not on, if you look at American sports, it's not what the record bore in the football weight room is. That's not the important thing. The important thing is, did you win? If you're not winning, then who cares? And so,
are you maximizing your potential in football?
Exactly. And so we look at it from that point of view, which is, very much in line with what you're saying. But what I'd like to do is, if you don't mind, I would love to do this, have you on again, because we're running. This one's a good size one already. Is talking the periodization and going from set to set. Because one of the things that's unique about Dr. B is that these guys can work out on Thursday and go to a meet on Saturday and be fine and still look great. Martin said he's gone to a lot of things. He said, I had my last session Thursday morning. He said in the meet Saturday, and there you go. I take a day off on Friday, and that's it. And he said, then I go throw. And I was like, really? You don't take a little bit longer of a taper period or whatever? He said, you don't need to. He said, I feel fresh pretty much every time I go out. Which is a unique idea amongst a lot of people.
That's another thing that changed a lot of my thinking in this system is how I set up tapers, or even if I do a taper.
Right.
If I do a taper, I mean, if an athlete is throwing further than they've ever thrown and you haven't tapered, why taper? Right. And I have a really good story. I have a really good example with the same British girl and a male that I coached there, Mark Dry, who's the Scottish record holder in the hammer. But I could share it now if you want.
Yeah, go ahead and lay it on me, and then we'll pick up in the next one from that. Go ahead.
Okay. Sounds good.
So go ahead and share it with us now. That'd be great, and then we'll use it as a lead into.
Okay. Sorry. Okay, so it is a really interesting story. The girl I was just talking about, she's a hammer thrower. She came to me when she was about 18 years old or so, and she was a young up-and-coming hammer thrower in Britain, fairly accomplished, but had decided to move down and train with me in Loughborough. Her and her boyfriend, who was a Scottish hammer thrower as well. Anyways, so the very first development cycle I ever did with her, brand new athlete, wasn't sure what to do. So I went, I didn't know, I wouldn't say I wasn't sure what to do. I had no data to look at. So I didn't, so I put together a program for her. And we were talking about those 3 reactions to training. Well, I have the chart. I use it in presentations all the time. So basically what happened was when we started recording all of her results, she's a classic number 2. So she would go down and then come back up and reach peak condition. So after about 45 or 50 sessions, she reached peak condition. And again, can't overstate this. Did not work out 1 or work out 50 was exactly the same as workout 1. Okay. No tapering, nothing. Same thing. So the last, and she was her PB before she came there was 62:13. In training at the end of that cycle, in the last week, she did 6 days straight of training. She couldn't train. Well, I didn't have her do twice a day right away. I had her do 6 plus 1. So in the last week, session number, whatever, 48, 49, 50 was on a Saturday. She had trained 6 days in a row. And on that Saturday, she threw, and the graph, she was just getting better every day. Remember, her lifetime PB in a comp was 62:13 before that. She threw 65:50 or something like that. She comes to me, and this is zero unloading, zero. But she's in the best shape of her life. Why? And I'm thinking to her, this girl doesn't need to be unloaded. What the hell do I need to taper for? What are you going to tell me? She just improved 3 meters. She's going to improve another 3 meters if I taper? I don't think so. So she came to me on the Saturday, her and Mark, and they were both throwing very well. And they were like, hey, we just found out there's a meet down the road tomorrow. Can we go throw? And I'm like, well, that'll be your 7th straight day of training. You've done no unloading and you want to compete? And they were like, we feel great. Like I've never been in this kind of shape. I feel amazing. I'm like, all right, go. I didn't even go to the meet. Said, go. British record.
Wow.
British record. He blew everybody away. He threw quite well as well. And it was like zero tapering.
Yeah.
But she was in peak condition. And so that, that's another strength of this system, is that when you don't have to unload them and you can get them into peak condition without unloading, they are very excuse me, my phone's ringing here.
No problem.
Sorry. They are very they're almost invincible. Like you have less issues, less variance, you have less issues to deal with. So
that'll be a great segue into the next talk on the periodization stuff, because I'm really interested in that, because like you said, the lack of the taper or peaking being there, the cycles being shorter, and total changes instead of dovetailing, change all the way across the board. There's a lot of different ideas there with him.
Sorry, it's my phone.
You're fine. Don't worry about it. And there's a lot of really interesting things there, because it is different than everybody else. So if you don't mind, we would love to have you back on here pretty soon and go through all the periodization stuff that you learned, and how it kind of how you saw it play out when you were with Dr. B, and then how it affected you afterwards.
And Joseph, anytime, I love sharing this, and I like to, I think, even though Dr. B sometimes will raise an eyebrow about it, I think it's important that we get a lot of this out there. Yeah. And I really encourage people to, to get the books and to study them, because even though they are difficult to get through, if you're using the system, even if you're not using the system, there's so much there that you can, hopefully after listening to something like this, or something that Martin does, or some of your other podcasts, you piece it all together, it all starts to make sense. And so, and I think you guys in particular have done a great job bringing some of this information. You certainly have the most digestible forms of Dr. B's work. I
appreciate that. I have to give all 100% of the credit to Dr. Yessis. He has been like a lone wolf in North America for many years, of being the guy saying, hey, look, what these guys are doing is really cool. This is really something unique. And, I was blessed that he ended up being the guy who kind of brought me along to understand the field better, because he's one of the few guys who understood the language and the science simultaneously and could really digest it. You know what I mean? Because like even for guys like you and I, you're reading stuff, and you're reading maybe a translated one, and there's not as much volume of work. But when he went to, when he started researching everything that was in Russian, I mean, it's voluminous, the amount of material that they were putting out. And what he always told me, it's like, he said, you can't even grasp how much material they produced. And he said for everything that I've translated, he said there's 1,000 other things that didn't make it.
Oh, absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Not all good.
What's
You
that?
know, I mean, not all of it's great either.
No, no,
but,
no, no, no.
But
No, but lots of stuff that,
I mean,
like what the thing, the point that he made was like, if Bondarchuk might reference somebody that you and I've never heard of, right?
yeah.
What'll be interesting is Dr. said, yeah, I read his book too. Where you know, does that make sense?
Oh, I know. I mean, the references in Dr. Bondarchuk's books, I mean,
It's 10 pages.
they're 5-6 pages long.
It makes my books more expensive. I can tell you that because I got to print way more pages for it.
I
For all of them. But anyway, thank you so much. I really appreciate you helping out with this and elucidating more of Dr. B, because like I said, I got 3 more books of his that are coming out, and you talking about the practicals really is great because it helps to kind of fill in some blanks for people who speak English, who say, okay, what did you actually do? You know what I mean? Yeah. How did it actually play out? I love that. And this is really beneficial because while it's immensely complicated, there's an elegant simplicity to it. You know.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. It can seem overwhelming,
Yeah.
but in its basic, it actually is probably the simplest system that one can implement. I mean, it's just that you got to be on top of it and you have to be involved in it.
You got to know what you're looking.
It is not recipe coaching.
No,
it's as far from that as exists. So, you know, if you like data, if you like to get your hands dirty in the nuts and bolts end of things of coaching, like you really like to get in there with adaptation, and then this is for you.
Yes.
If you're not into that, if you want to just write a program, throw it on the wall and not worry about, then don't do this program because you're going to be disappointed.
It's going to be, yeah, right. No, you're exactly right. Well, thank you so much again. I'm going to be getting back in touch with you here in the next couple of weeks, and let's try this again because I think you got a ton of stuff that would be great to share with our listeners.
Sure, anytime.
All right, thanks a lot, Derek. All right.